Hey guys, what's up? It's filtersc and I'm back for another video. This time it's the Wood to Bronze series, and we're going to be taking a look at managing your production, when you should be adding on your production and all that kind of fun stuff. This is one of the biggest areas of the game that is often overlooked by players. They'll quite often be like, whatever, this isn't that important when it comes to my macro, I'm spending all my money, blah blah blah. And what happens is you'll see players, they just won't make any units at all. They'll add on tech, they'll start, rushing to get all this stuff up really quickly. And if you get it too fast, it actually slows you down overall. It's one of the weirdest aspects of StarCraft 2, where you feel like you need to get everything really quickly. You'll see players adding on, an engineering bay really quickly. They'll add on 2 sometimes even, right? And then just not get the upgrades out of them. So you want to be really careful when you're adding production and infrastructure to your base, because if you overdo it, you can put yourself in a big trouble, because you need to be making units consistently all the time. But more importantly, you need to make sure that you have that production available with you when the game really steps up and starts to become quite difficult. So with that in mind, it's vital to winning the game and keeping up. If you're playing your opponent, whatever, you guys are trading out, things are going relatively well, but you only have 3 barracks at home. However, you've basically spent all your money. But you've got a couple of Marauders in queue and a couple of Marines and a couple of SCVs and all that kind of stuff. And your opponent has the same problem, but then he notices it and he pulls those units out and adds on more production. You guys have both kind of spent your money properly, at least according to the way the game works, and one guy is going to have more barracks. So what's going to happen is, eventually, as expansions go up and that kind of stuff, you're going to start to bank up money, and your opponent's not going to bank that money up. He's actually going to be making more units than you, and you're going to end up losing the game because he's just going to have more stuff, right? When you look at any game of StarCraft 2 and you look at, who wins and who loses, more often than not, the winning player is the player who has the most production buildings. He's the guy that took the time to add on more stuff so that he was in better shape to win, right? He's the guy with 12 gateways instead of 8 in the PvP. You look at Terran versus Terran, and there's, the guy with 3 barracks that have been constantly producing units, and the other guy might have been in a little bit of trouble and had to defend a little bit harder, but all of a sudden he's got 5 barracks, and the game just kind of snaps completely in his favor. So you really have to watch for that, because it's one of the biggest keys to winning the game. Quite often people have talked about the Zerg inject cycle and how important that is and that kind of stuff with Zerg. And that's the most obvious example. If you're missing injects, you're not going to have the ability to produce units. The same thing applies to Protoss and Terran, though. If you're not throwing down and adding on your production buildings, you're not going to be able to produce units, and you're not going to be able to keep up, and you're going to bank up and eventually lose. So, it's very obvious with all the talk about auto-inject and that kind of stuff that has been going on. One of the biggest areas that you can get better is just making sure you have enough production to consistently be making units, and you're not rushing and adding on all this crazy tech and getting all these crazy upgrades when you're not going to do anything with them because you just don't have any units to actually attack with. It doesn't really matter if you have 2-2 really quickly if you have like 6 or 7 Marines, right? And that's the point we're going to talk about today, and that's what we're going to go through in this particular video. So with that in mind, the first thing you need to do when you're looking at getting your production up and running and making sure it's up to working at its highest possible potential is just check your unit queues and see if you need to cancel units and add barracks, right? It doesn't really matter if you know the exact numbers of production buildings you're supposed to have on every base, and this is a little bit more of a Terran thing than it is with the other races. But what is important is that you look at your money and you're like, okay, I have like an extra 200 or 300 minerals, I'm going to add on a couple barracks, and then you check your barracks, that's why you see players cycle through, and then you might go, oh man, I actually have like 3 Marauders queued up in this one and 2 in that. I'm going to cancel those extra Marauders that I don't need, and I'm going to add on another couple barracks. And you add all those on early on when, less is going on in the game. And a barracks will take about 2 minutes to come online when you start talking about add-ons and all that kind of stuff. For Protoss, a gateway is going to take about a minute to come online. For Zerg, when you're talking about hatcheries, you're talking about a hatchery and getting a queen over there to start injecting it and that kind of stuff. All that takes a lot of time to get online, right? A hatchery is almost a minute and a half to build, right? Like, you're talking about a long period of time within the game where you just don't have anything coming off this investment into a production building. And if you notice too late that you need extra production, you're just going to bank a ton of money and end up losing the game, right? So make sure you're watching for those unit queues. Make sure you're adding on the production when you need it. And don't be afraid to overdo it, right? Always do it with your extra money. And this applies, again, more towards Zerg and more towards Protoss, because Terran will typically have the extra money just queued up. So Terran players will have to go and cancel it, find the money, and then add on the production. If you're playing Zerg or Protoss and you look and you have like 1,000 extra minerals, rather than warping in, like 10 zealots, because like if you don't have charge, maybe the zealots aren't going to do very much, right? Rather than just warping in like 10 zealots that really aren't going to do anything for you, add on extra gateways, because at the end of the day, if you add on, 4 or 5 or 6 extra gateways to your initial like 3 or 4 that you might have, it's going to help you out a lot more in the long run, right? Because of the kind of double production cycle. If you add on your extra, let's say you just take your expansion and there's really no probes mining from it or whatever, and you have an extra 400 or 500 minerals, and you warp in like 4 or 5 zealots, those zealots aren't going to do anything for you if you don't need them right away, right? They're just not going to be useful. So if you add on, an extra few gateways, by the time you get mineral saturation on that extra base, you're going to be in a much better place, right? Because you're going to have 6 or 7 gateways or 8 gateways rather than just having, 4 or 5 zealots and your original gateways. All of a sudden, you're going to start banking up money and then add on the gateways much later on than you actually need them. For that short period of time, you might have the same number of units, but you're going to be in much better shape because you've already added on the production. And that's kind of the key to StarCraft 2, is just adding on the extra production. Don't be afraid to overdo it. Don't be afraid to get, what you might even perceive as too many barracks, too many hatcheries, A lot of Zerg players will look at a pro game and see, Sue with his 3 bases or 4 bases or whatever in his macro hatch, and he'll just have like 5 hatcheries. But Sue hits all of his injects like 100% of the time, right? You're not going to do that. You just won't. So it's okay if you add on an extra hatchery for the macro cycle. Even if you're not able to inject it, sometimes it's going to be worth it, right? So just make sure you're not afraid to add on extra production so you can have that big army and you can just overwhelm your opponent. Rather than banking up in the late game, it's much better to be in a situation where you cannot spend all of your money producing units out of your production facilities. If you had just purely as a weird example, if you had 15 barracks and a big fight happens or whatever, and you're able to pump out 15 units out of those, and then 8 or 9 in the next round, that's going to be much more effective than 5 barracks trying to pump out that same number of units that's even with your economy, right? So really, don't be afraid to overdo it. Always check your production, check your queues, check your money, and see if you need to add on more, and then just go ahead and add on more production. It's very, very important to winning the game of StarCraft 2. And we're going to talk about tech in just a second, but this is an area that I see commonly the most mistakes made. And what happens is players don't check for extra production coming online before they start adding tech, right? And what you'll see far too often players will start adding upgrades. They'll get things like Colossus range. Combat shield's actually a big one that people will get too early. And for Zerg players, a lot of times they'll be getting +2/+2 and burrow and all this kind of crazy stuff instead of producing units when they should be making units, right? And, even to the detriment sometimes of workers, which is the biggest sin you can make, right? So you really want to make sure that you're checking your production and seeing if it's coming online before you start adding on tech and getting upgrades and all that kind of stuff. As a Zerg player, it really does you no good to start roach speed +1 or +1/+1 and, maybe a Hydralisk Den and, get 2 or 3 Overseers and then all your injects pop off. That's one of the worst things you can do as a Zerg player, right? Because all of a sudden now you have all this extra larva that's not going to be used for anything. You won't even have enough money to make drones out of it. When if you had just made, massive, a big batch of roaches or something like that off it, you'd be in much better shape when your opponent does attack, right? So, really pay attention to your upgrades, right? A lot of people talk about the difficulty of holding a 10-pool Bane, right? And you'll see Zergs oh man, that guy 10-pool Baned. And I'm watching the game and I see the Zerg still mine gas and still started Zergling speed and had larva but couldn't do anything with it, right? And the Zergling speed is never going to finish before a 10-pool Bane hits you. It's just not. It's impossible. So why mine that gas, right? Why not just mine minerals? Because you can mine the minerals and spend the money, right? And that's that is what allows you to hold. You actually pull out of gas and you stop going for the tech, just so you can get units up. Same sort of thing. If you're, if a Protoss player is coming with an aggressive build, it's okay to cancel your upgrades if you need to get units out, right? Or just not start them, right? As a Terran player, if I do a Hellbat Marine all-in or something, and the Zerg player's all of a sudden trying to get +1/+1 before he got his Baneling Nest, before he got his lair, and then my Banshees come, he's in a ton of trouble, and he's probably going to lose the game, right? And those upgrades and stuff, while they're important, they don't matter if you just lose instantly, right? So you really have to check to see if you're going to have production coming online before you start adding tech. And those are extreme examples, but one of the biggest offenders that I often see, even in games where I watch the replay, is the Protoss player will throw down his robo, he'll get like an observer or two or something out of it. He won't get an immortal or anything like that, even though immortals are absolutely god tier units in every stage of the game. And then he'll get his robo facility and robotics bay, and then he'll just kind of wait around a little bit. When the robo bay finishes, he'll start getting the 200, which is almost as much as a Colossus range upgrade, which, while it makes Colossus incredibly powerful, it doesn't make them powerful if you don't actually have any, right? And then he'll get +1, and then he'll get, +1 armor. He'll get all these upgrades, and he won't make Colossus, and then he'll die, because the gateway units are just not going to hold up. And it really doesn't matter if you have +1/+1 almost finished or finished, and Colossus range, almost finished or finished, if you have one Colossus or don't have any, right? I mean, the alternative is you could have 3 Colossus, and your range would be finishing up a little bit later, but that's still much better defensively than just having one Colossus or having nothing else, right? So make sure you're really focusing on this kind of stuff. Zergs are really bad for this. Terran players, I know, are really bad for this too. So you have to be really careful about adding on all this extra tech and going for all these upgrades, when the reality is, if as a Terran player I get 2 engineering bays and +1/+1, I could have just had 4 extra barracks that are going to make a much, much bigger difference in a TVT than any of those upgrades ever will, right? I'm going to get the upgrades eventually anyway, and as long as I'm not attacking around it, I'm going to be okay. Which leads me into my next point. Your tech should be based entirely around your timing of when you want to either attack or if you need something key defensively. So what that means is, don't get an upgrade if you're not going to use it, right? You don't need to get Hydralisk speed off creep if you're not going to leave creep with your Hydralisks, right? If you're building them to defend against Mutalisks or something like that, and you have creep spread out towards your third, which, Hydras aren't that great at doing anyway, but if that's your plan, then don't bother getting Hydralisk speed right away. Save the upgrade, get it for later when you want to attack, right? The same sort of thing applies to stuff like stim and combat shields. When you watch a lot of high-level Terran games where Terran players are playing against Protoss now, quite often they're actually delaying stim for a very long time so they can get stuff like Widow Mines and things like that. And the reason it doesn't hurt them is because they don't really need stim that early in the game. If I'm putting pressure on the Protoss player so he's not going to be attacking me, I don't need stim. It doesn't do anything for me. Stim is very much so an offensive upgrade, right? So what that means is I can delay it because I'm not going to be attacking, because my barracks aren't going to be producing enough units to actually attack with for a long time. So that means, getting stim at 11 or 12 minutes in a TVP is actually more than okay if I'm, opening up with a lot of mine drops and stuff like that, right? Another example is combat shield. Quite often for Terran players, if you're playing bio against a Zerg player, you'll wait on combat shield and you won't get it right away. And combat shield seems like it's relatively cheap, and for the most part it is, but you're much better off to start 2-2 because 2-2 takes longer to build than combat shield ever will, right? You don't need to start it right away. And the reason you don't start it right away is because generally you're going to wait for 2-2 before you start doing aggressive moves on creep. And if your combat shield is a very fast upgrade and lines up with 2-2, why not just delay it? So when you watch a lot of high-level professional games, you'll actually see quite often, even the casters will be like, oh, he hasn't started combat shield yet. That might, he's obviously waiting for his attack or whatever, right? And, sure enough, the combat shield will start at the right time and it'll finish at the right time. So don't be afraid to delay your upgrades based around your timings and get more production buildings, get more units out. Because the upgrades, the coolest thing about StarCraft is the upgrades apply to units already built, right? And the reality is you really don't need that +1/+1 or +2/+2 until you're actually attacking, right? It doesn't matter if you get it earlier. The same sort of thing applies with Protoss, like I said, with the Colossus thing. Don't be afraid to delay Colossus range. When you watch high-level Protosses play against Terrans, they're getting upgrades very slowly, right? They're a much heavier focus on having a lot of units because they can get the upgrades slowly, because if Terran goes greedy and tries to go for a lot of upgrades, Terran really cannot get 2-2 and not die to a Protoss attack even if the Protoss army is 0-0, right? Just the nature of the way Colossus work, and if they have an overwhelming number of units, which they will if you're going for those upgrades, you're going to lose, right? So Terrans typically go for their upgrades quite slowly against Protoss, so in response, Protoss go for their upgrades very slowly as well. Yes, you're going to run into the odd guy on ladder that's going to play super greedy and get all his upgrades and all that kind of crap, and you're going to lose to it, but eventually you're going to get better at punishing that kind of play, right? It's actually a good thing to kind of really slow down on your upgrades and get used to slowing down on your upgrades and just having a lot more units and then doing something with your units than, mashing out all the upgrades you possibly can. This is actually a mistake I used to make a lot. And, if you attack around the timing of when the upgrade's finished, that's awesome. You're going to have a lot of success. But if you're just mindlessly getting the upgrades and then you have 2-2, or you have, some really cool upgrade like Stim or Colossus range, but you don't actually have very many Colossus, or you don't have very much bio, that upgrade's not doing anything for you. So you need to be really, really careful with it. And the last point in relation to Zerg is, for a Zerg player, you want to be really, really careful about getting those upgrades, right? Because for a Zerg player, quite often the choice is, am I going to get drones and upgrades, or am I going to get units? Because of the way your money spent works and the way your economy works, right? So if you make a ton of drones and upgrades and then you get attacked, you're going to lose because none of the upgrades are going to be there and you won't have any units, right? So be really careful with that. For Zerg, if you want to make this work, you really have to scout what your opponent's doing beforehand so that you kind of, you have a feel if you're going to be safe to do the drone upgrade thing and then go into the units, right? But if you're not going to be safe, then, get the units first. It's really, really simple, really straightforward, really easy way to win, and it'll help make you a much more consistent player. That's one of the biggest things. If, I'll see ProDOS players all the time on ladder, and for the most part, I can usually beat them if they go for really, really heavy upgrade styles, like a lot of fast upgrades, right? But I'll still lose to them occasionally. However, for the ProDOS player, I bet Terran feels like completely bullshit to them, right? They probably hate playing against Terran and have a really hard time because they put so much emphasis into getting those upgrades. And when they do fight and they are playing the game, they're almost always going to be fighting at a massive advantage because they played really greedy to get there with, the big upgrades and eventually get like the good, big, powerful, strong army. So they're not even going to be used to fighting like on what I would consider even footing, right? Every other time they're going to lose. So while they might have the same win-loss as like another guy who's quote-unquote playing properly, at the end of the day, the guy who's quote-unquote playing properly is going to have a lot more to analyze from his games, and he's going to have a lot more ability to get better than the guy who's just blindly getting upgrades, right? It adds consistency to your gameplay, and it makes you a better player over time if you can get used to this concept of slowing down your upgrades to favor production. It's a really hard concept. It's one of the most difficult parts of StarCraft 2 to get right. It takes a very long time, but at the same time, if you're already starting off and you're just trying to learn the game initially, like, always be adding production, just focus on getting a ton of units, and don't necessarily worry too much about your upgrades, except when you want to attack. That's all you have to do. Get your upgrades when you're going to attack, boys. Anyway, my name is filtersc, and I will see you guys next time for the next With Bronze series video. Have a good one, take care, enjoy the game, boys.